Hey everybody, how's it going? Michael Ojibwe here from Invisible Choir. Wanted to thank everybody for your continued support. This is one of the few times I'm going to get in front of the camera, so um, I'm most comfortable on the other side. Anyhow, one of the first questions we received, and I get this one quite often actually, um, has to do with launching Invisible Choir. I don't think everyone knows that when I first started the show, actually over about a year and a half ago. It was called Invisible Choir, but it was all cases of missing and murdered Indigenous women. If my last name didn't imply Ojibwe, that is my real name. I'm Native American, Anishinaabe, I'm Redcliffe Ojibwe. These are cases that had particular meaning, and I wanted to prioritize them because there weren't other podcasts covering these cases. There wasn't a lot of media attention on some of these missing and murdered Indigenous women cases, and this is an epidemic across the U.S. and Canada. Indigenous women, I think that the statistic is that they experience the murder rates at over 10 times the national average. And there's a multitude of reasons there, some that are rooted in, colonialism, drugs and alcohol, gangs, etc. But what you typically don't see is the same priority with regard to media coverage and dedication, specifically in the podcast space, to covering these types of cases. So, and I keep looking at my wonky eye here. For those of you who have heard the interviews, and this plays into another question: how did I get into true crime? Or where does my fascination come from? I was actually victim of a very violent crime in 2006, and there's remnants of it in my face. And in terms of the damage that these guys did, I was essentially, for those of you who don't know, I was essentially beaten and left for dead. Had swelling on the brain. They had fractured my orbital. They had crushed other parts of my face. I had bruised ribs. They had scraped the skin off my forehead from dragging my body along the sidewalk, kicking me in the face. When I finally came to in the ambulance on the way to the hospital about 15, 20 minutes later, my head was literally swollen up to the size of about a basketball. So there was a time when I thought I was going to lose this eye. The doctors thought I was going to lose that eye. As you can see, kind of the tracking is a little bit off, so generally I have glasses and things like that. But this is why I don't get in front of the camera very often. The human body is an exceptionally resilient creature, but that's how I got into podcasting. Because in my own case, I never got justice. They never caught the guys who did this to me. And so I know what it's like to have that moment of instantaneous helplessness. And I think I come from a particular level of empathy and compassion because I always am reflecting on that. Anytime I'm trying to examine these cases, excuse me, I try to do so in a way that is as respectful as possible. Because I was that guy. After my assault, even newspaper reporters calling me up to try to get information, when they used the word alleged, that pissed me off because I wasn't allegedly assaulted. I almost lost an eyeball. Face doesn't work the same way that it used to. I've got permanent inflammation from all the tissue damage that these guys did. So that's where that level of respect and empathy comes from. I don't necessarily openly share that all the time, but I've grown more comfortable with it over the years. So another question, moving on. What is your day job? So I'm not going to give you all of the specifics other than to say I've worked for about the last 10 years as an equal opportunity investigator, both in the higher education administration and for a state prison system. But I currently work as a marketing and multimedia strategist. So I've kind of transitioned more into the media side of prison work. Not going to share the specifics of that because I do spend a lot of time inside of correctional facilities and I don't need all sorts of information out there floating around about where I do or do not work. So I do spend a lot of time in the prisons, interacting with people who are incarcerated, but I predominantly spend my time now with the media, doing media engagement, other strategies like that. So that's kind of the day job, and it's a full-time career. So the 40 or 50 hours per week that I also spend on Invisible Choir comes in the late night hours and on weekends. So, which is why I'm always so tired and constantly battling another illness or bronchitis. But I'm just going to start going through the questions. What are your thoughts on the McDonald triad? For those of you who haven't heard of that, that's a question that comes up in true crime circles quite often. If you haven't heard of the McDonald triad, I think references sociopathic tendencies specific to youth. So it's kind of a controversial model, because I think they say that, you know, if a if a youth coming up exhibits bedwetting, extreme cruelty to animals, and a fascination with starting fires or arson, that, you know, that there's a predisposition there or a causal connection specifically to sociopathic tendencies, or the potential for serial homicide, serial killing, things of that nature. I like to distance myself from that type of predictive antisocial behavior. I think for whatever reason or another, there are a variety of factors that could be involved in, especially a child that's still in the developmental or formative years, exhibiting those types of behaviors. Some maybe coming as a result or in response to particular types of abuse. So these are, in other cases, these could be, you know, very typical antisocial behaviors that are symptomatic of deeper mental health concerns. I think that for a lot of folks, there are a lot of overlapping factors of life experience that maybe people who commit murder share in common. I'm not prepared to fully go on record and say what those are, or attach those to my name, so I'm not going to do that. So I don't ascribe to the McDonald triad, whatever you want to call it, as a predictive model. I don't think it's fair to the many children who exhibit one, two, or all three of those behaviors and then go on to lead perfectly happy, healthy lives. Can you pin your true crime interest down to a specific time or stage in your life? Well, I had mentioned first and foremost being a victim of a violent assault. You know, I think I never got that justice. They never found out who did it. So that's always been in the back of my mind. I've always been extremely curious about it. I suffered a lot with post-traumatic stress in the months immediately following. I developed a lot of irrational fears of men. I was crossing the street, avoiding coming into close contact with other men. Just developed all kinds of very irrational fears. And it's taken years of good, honest, hard work for me to process that and to lead a comfortable life, especially now walking in and out of prisons where in any given day I may come into contact with dozens or hundreds of people convicted of murder. That's part of the reality. That's part of my lived reality now. Coupling that environment with being immersed in true crime on nights and weekends, it goes right to the next question. Do you feel like the time you've spent researching and compiling details may be overwhelmingly gruesome has had a negative impact on your own personal psyche? What do you use to brain bleach? I don't think it's been destructive or overly destructive to my personal psyche. I think already, for a variety of reasons, which I've already touched on, my level of general situational awareness is much higher than most, because my safety has been compromised to the extent that it's transformed my life and how I interact with the world. But you know, I also think that writing true crime, researching, watching the videos, listening to the audio, the interrogations, the confessions, you see and hear a lot of things that you can't unsee, that you can't unhear. For me, I've been no stranger about this. I occasionally get nightmares. I occasionally, have very lucid dreams about some of the cases, especially if I've been completely immersed in a particular case for a couple of days, late into the evening. Um, Generally, I'll decompress. I do have to disengage for a day or two. So, whether that be like a Thursday, Friday, or a Friday, Saturday, Saturday, Sunday, generally I'll take 1 or 2 days off and completely disengage from true crime, so that so that I'm not constantly living in a confirmation bias environment where I'm looking for these things to happen all around me, which can happen if you're constantly immersed in these horrendous, gruesome crimes. What do I do to brain bleach? I watch a lot of Netflix at night just to unwind. Generally during meals, I'll watch comedies, The Office, a lot of just what I call mindless sitcom. I watch Frasier, The Office, um, a couple of other comedy shows I can't think of off the top of my head, but in part because I'm never paying attention. I'm not usually actually watching. I'm usually just hanging out with the dog or my wife or reading. So I also do a ton of reading, fictional novels, mystery, crime. Generally, we'll read one book a week. So I'm a pretty active reader. I read a ton, and I own more books than I'll ever read because every time I go to the bookstore, I buy 8 or 9 more that I do not need or will not read. So I think it's important to stay actively involved. I also produce music. I play guitar, and I just like to learn. I'm constantly reading. So that's the stuff that I have to do to get out of that mindset. And I think to be constantly immersed in it, again, for anyone, likely is not healthy in terms of it having any overly negative or destructive tendencies. No, I get that question from close family a lot. Like, oh, you're doing true crime. What's that say about you? Well, I'll share this stuff openly, but it doesn't make me, I don't engage in this work from a place of morbid curiosity that some might. I'm coming from, again, a very real place of wanting to bring visibility to certain types of crimes that I view in most cases as preventable, where certain systems may have touched individuals a number of different times, and maybe police missed the warning signs, or the Department of Public Services, Child Protective Services. That's why I go down those rabbit holes, and that's why you're hearing those types of cases on Invisible Choir. Another question: being so invested in true crime, do you ever catch yourself thinking, yep, that person is going to snap and kill somebody? No, I don't. Maybe in the immediate months after I was assaulted, I had those irrational fears of like, dude, this guy in the grocery store, he's looking at me funny, and I went into ultra high defense mode to the point where I would go into offense. I was going to shut a situation down before it came to me. So I got involved in boxing and some other things relating to self-defense. But ultimately, the post-traumatic stress there created an environment that wasn't healthy. And so with a little bit of therapy and counseling, I've been able to make peace with that. And I don't cross the street when some random man is approaching me, and things like that. So, but do I ever think to myself that, look at what that person's doing, they're going to snap and kill somebody? It goes to what I said with the McDonald triad. I don't like to ascribe those type of predictive mechanisms in my own interactions with people, especially because I think the minute you think you have someone pinned down, somebody else comes along and proves your whole theory or perspective on predicting human behavior completely wrong. So no, I don't ever look at somebody and think that person's going to snap. In fact, if I've learned anything working in the prison systems over the years, that it's actually sometimes the nicest and most friendly people are in for some of the most gruesome crimes. In part because those people are typically in for life, and most lifers view the prison as their house. They call their cell my house. And that is literally their home, and they view it as such. And so they're not as invested in the fights and the gang violence and things like that. So sometimes there have been days when I've had great conversations with somebody who's incarcerated and return to my office at a later date or later that evening and seen that maybe they were in for some absolutely terrible crimes, worse crimes than we'll probably ever cover on the podcast for a variety of reasons. So I don't think that you can look at someone and determine if they're just going to snap. I think that you can certainly be mindful and cognizant of antisocial and other concerning behavior. But it's like I said before, there could be a variety of reasons, and I never like to judge people preemptively and put them into that type of category. Now, occasionally I'll look at somebody and think to myself, that person may be very nearing a pending breaking point, in which case I'll remove myself from that situation or de-escalate. But I've never looked at someone and predicted them snapping and killing anybody. Next question. What do you feel sets Invisible Choir apart from other true crime podcasts? I've heard this question a couple of times, mostly from the people who are writing the Apple reviews, saying things like, hey, Invisible Choir is a literal carbon freaking copy of Sword and Scale. Why even create a podcast? First of all, Invisible Choir is categorically different than Sword and Scale. And I think if you don't hear a fundamental difference in the writing, in the narrative, in the methods that we deploy in examining these horrendous cases, we are very intentionally crafting these episodes from a place of respect, of respecting and acknowledging the victim's experience, from a place of compassion. And that for me is it comes through that personal experience of knowing that I'm always going to have trouble with my vision, or that one half of my face works better than the other half. It's almost mimicked like the effects of a stroke. That gives me a different perspective when I dive into these cases and when I work with writers, because I know what it's like to have heard coverage of my own assault and to have been pissed off again about people asking me questions or insinuating that because I did have a couple of drinks that night, that I was somehow to blame for nearly losing my life. And that's just fundamentally wrong. So I think, one of the things that separates us is just, I'll always maintain the executive producer control. I'm not somebody, if a writer submits a story to me, it may be just, it may be very well written, maybe an excellent perspective on the case. But if I don't feel it conveys enough compassion or empathy for the victim, if it doesn't bring the listener to a place of emotional investment with the victim and their family, I will either expand it, I will editorialize and rewrite portions of it while I'm narrating and engineering. And I think that separates me. I don't ever envision myself getting to the point with this show where I'm ever just hiring writers to write cases and getting on the microphone and narrating those and then handing it off to an engineer. I'm extremely, extremely particular with how we write these stories. And generally, no matter the script that any of my writers has ever presented, generally I'm putting my own spin on it to take it to that next level, both in terms of emotional investment, but ensuring that we're not inserting or coming off in any way as overly sarcastic, jokey, or otherwise offensive, either to the victims or even to the perpetrators, in an unnecessary compassionate fashion if we don't have to. Apart from that, I think just the sound quality. I think I've heard from a lot of people they're very impressed with the sound quality of Invisible Choir. We don't use the plugins and tools that a lot of sound engineers on other podcasts will use. To me, I'm a bit of a purist with the engineering, so you're not going to hear the plugins and tools used to eliminate natural reverb of my acoustic space. I've got foam tiles and everything, and acoustic diffusers that I rely on to do much of that work preemptively for me, so that there's not a lot of echo, things of that nature. And I also do a heavy amount of manual editing. So, I've also got some chronic lung issues just from some other health related things. So most of you know I had pneumonia. I had chronic bronchitis for a stretch there, and I'm still actually getting over that almost 2 months later. Sometimes I'm recording in 8 to 10 second chunks and micro editing in that regard. So I think the level of quality, attention to detail, if I ever encounter a name on a script or in a news article or in a public data affidavit file or interrogation report, I will find out how to pronounce that person's name. I never assume, even if it looks like the name is Johnson, I will verify. If I can't find it online, either a city name or an individual's name, I'll call them up. I'll call somebody from the region. I'll get into touch with somebody that lives in the region. I'll call the individual and listen to how they pronounce their own name on their voicemail. It's creepy. Yes, maybe, but it also, it's the level of dedication that I bring to accuracy with the show. And so I think that's what separates us, I hope, and sets us apart from other podcasts, true crime podcasts. Do you sometimes find yourselves overwhelmed or disturbed at times by the sometimes gruesome or gory details of some crimes, or do you feel you're fairly desensitized to the horrors of the world? Yes and no. Have I ever been overwhelmed or disturbed? Absolutely. When we cover cases specifically regarding children, there are times where if I'm immersed in the recordings or the DVD interrogations that the Attorney General has mailed to my house, there are times I have to get up and walk away, just because no one should be completely immersed in this stuff at all times. And if ever you're deriving any sense of gratification from that, you may have other issues that need addressing. So for me, it's never a pleasant experience in that way. But I've never been desensitized. Maybe it happens with some people, and maybe it's just my own unique personal lived experience in that regard. But every time, if I'm ever looking at a crime scene photo or something like that, the cringe factor never goes away. If I know that I'm about to look at a very graphic picture or video, I still have to kind of mentally prepare myself for that, same as most other folks, I would assume. I've not found myself growing desensitized to that, again, because I think I have a relatively unique position of understanding when it comes to seeing what happens to the human body, for instance, when it's been viciously traumatized in one way or another, because I've been there. And that's very tough for me to look at, and it always will be. Do I feel like I've been desensitized to the horrors of the world? No, I think if anything, I've become admittedly more situationally aware between my day job and occasionally walking through, prisons where we're in and amongst some very dangerous people. But I also think that being immersed in true crime 24 hours a day, if anything, the opposite is true. And my wife could tell you this, if we're out in a restaurant or something, for a variety of reasons, I have a particular seat that I like to have, where I can have a good peripheral view of what's going on around us in the event something would happen. Not in an overly aggressive way or anything like that, but just in a precautionary way, in a way that I phrase as situational awareness. And I think true crime for me has heightened that a little bit. And I kind of alluded to this, and I'm going to dive right in. Question number 7. Did you used to write for Sword and Scale? If so, why did you leave? Were you fired? and I won't read the other questions here. There's only certain things I'm going to say about that. Number one, I've never denied writing and producing for Sword and Scale. I did for a brief time. It's not like I spent years at writing and producing for Sword and Scale. I was there for a very limited period of time. In the end, I think I only wrote and published 6 episodes. And I left on my own volition. I was not fired. I was not terminated. For me, it was always a side hustle. So I always kept my day job. And ultimately, what it boiled down to for me was the owner of that company asked me to come on full time. And rightfully so, he wanted my full attention, writing and producing and not working a full-time job. We were not able to come to an agreement of what that would look like in terms of stability. And I made the decision to leave. Certain people have tweeted certain things. People have fueled into rumors on Reddit. If you guys have questions, ask me. I'm never going to lie about this stuff. Did I demand a $150,000 salary for Mike Boudet? That is categorically false. He tweeted that. As an experienced investigator, one of the things I do is keep a meticulous log of every text message, DM, messenger, email, phone call if that's permissibly recorded. That's categorically false. I didn't demand an outrageous salary. We were in negotiations for what I thought was fair. We didn't come to an agreement. And at the end of the day, I didn't feel the show was offering enough stability. I left, and shortly after I left, my concerns regarding stability were very much validated. So I don't look back on that. Having said that, I have nothing negative to say about Mike Boudet. He was always very respectful and professional with me. Now his behavior online and some of the commentary that he regularly deploys, I fundamentally disagree with. Now, having said that, knowing what I know about Mike, I always had good interactions with him. I didn't see much of what people claim. And beyond that, it's not my place to pass judgment or say things about somebody. I worked for him for a short time, and he was always respectful. Beyond that, I've tried not to carbon copy Sword and Scale. One of the questions that I was asked during my interview with that podcast was, well, gosh, you have this other show called Invisible Choir, and I did at the time. Again, previously it was all episodes produced about missing and murdered Indigenous women. One of the questions that Mike asked me was, well, do you consider yourself an SJW? And I said, well, first of all, I'd have to ask, what the hell is an SJW? Well, a social justice warrior. And I answered that question honestly. And I said, yeah, I think so. Not knowing the full extent of Mike's beliefs and perspectives and how he interacts with the world. So I've always been very honest and forthright in my experience with Sword and Scale. I loved writing for the show. The first case that I did was the Amari Varela case. I believe it was in the 120s. It was a very difficult case having to do with children, but one that I felt exposed some tremendous shortcomings of the Albuquerque, New Mexico police and Child Protective Services. And that's something that I hope carries into Invisible Choir. Very quickly, I became aware that it wasn't a business model or an environment that I was comfortable writing in. I really wanted to dive into those cases and explore the emotional investment of the listener a little bit more in exposing those otherwise preventable crimes, which is why you hear that as a sort of constant underlying theme with Invisible Choir. But yes, I did work for Sword and Scale for a short time. I enjoyed it. A lot of the blowback from his behavior rubs off on otherwise very ethical, talented people, and that was unfortunate. That's probably the greatest tragedy of my time working for that podcast was working with folks whose professional legacies maybe were tarnished by the actions of a few and not by their own actions. That's all I'll say about it. Again, I can't say anything negative about the guy. We always had professional, respectful interactions. He gave me an opportunity, a chance. He taught me some things early on. Beyond that, I never actually really got to know the guy beyond some of the surface level stuff. With all the other true crime podcasts out there, what made you decide you could add something worthwhile? Again, I think what I hope people hear with Invisible Choir, you're getting the same scale of immersive true crime experience that you would from a Sword and Scale, True Crime Garage to a certain extent, by sort of exploring the voices and the behaviors and the actions of people that were there through primary source audio. But my hope is that you're digesting this stuff in a way that's much more obviously compassionate and respectful. First and foremost to the victims, but also to the communities, the families involved. And hopefully we do a much more intentional job of exploring some of that stuff. So hopefully we're bringing a higher level of empathy and compassion. Apart from that, I think just the attention to detail and the quality. One of the things that people have said from day one is that they're just shocked, like, wow, when most podcasts start out, the quality is noticeably different. For the most part, beyond some of the cadence and the narrative pacing things that I've learned since launching this show, the content, the quality of the content remains, I believe, about the same. And I don't think that we're on a scale of improvement, because I literally spent months with a small team of professionals that I hired to craft what the show would look and sound and feel like. And so we've been excruciatingly intentional in every move we've done. Go out to the website right now. Look at the logo. If you haven't seen a very small change to it already, one thing you'll learn about me as you continue to listen to the show is I love to drop those Easter egg clues all over our marketing presence, whether that be social media, online, occasionally in the episodes themselves. I love to give people clues of evolutions or changes that might be coming in the show. And there are a couple that are coming to Invisible Choir that'll get us a little closer back to our roots in some of the cases that we cover. So be mindful of things like that. Everything that I do is with intense meaning and purpose. And so I will never put something out publicly with little or no thought. And I don't react impulsively like others do on social media and things like that. My strategy from day one, and a lot of you have commented on this, there have been a lot of harsh criticisms out there and things like that about my connection or rumored connection to Sword and Scale, what that did or did not look like. And ultimately, if you didn't hear it from me, it likely isn't true, because I'm very forthcoming with the truth. And that's just in my nature. Another question here. Do you see the future of Invisible Choir staying in line with individuals who seem to only commit single or mass murder incidents, or do you think you'll explore infamous serial killers? We certainly may go into, examining cases of serial homicide in the future, serial killers. But we're definitely never going to try to cover a serial killer in one episode. I think that, if an individual was convicted of killing 8-9 people, generally you need 8-9 hours to tell those stories. I think that, if you're not permitting yourself enough time to adequately dive into the details of each case, I don't have any interest of glossing over particular details. And I think, especially in the scope of a single episode format, which is, kind of our primary, I think at best we'll do 2-parters in the future. So it may be very unlikely that we dive into serial killers. I think that there are just so many layered complexities to those individuals, the crimes they commit, and the victims that are impacted, that I don't envision us doing a 5 or 8 part series. It's just not the model in the way that I've designed it for the show. So probably not. We'll probably continue to stick to the single or mass casualty incidents with an individual responsible who's generally come to some level of closure. Now, having said that, take a look at the invisiblechoir.com website. There's going to be some new content coming out in the coming months where we will occasionally dive into unsolved cases of individuals who are missing with a heavy suspicions of foul play, where I've had an opportunity to sit down and talk with family members and people directly impacted by those actions. What drives your music choices? That was a question that we got. We get that one a lot. One of the comments I get, and the most common email that I get at our customer service email is, hey, what's the song, what's the outro song to episode such and such, or what's the intro song? We contract through a company called Epidemic Sound, which is, we're licensing all music, sound effects, etc. per episode in perpetuity. So anything that we publish today, we've effectively licensed that song into the future. So which is the reason why we seldom use the same ambient noise tracks, droning effect tracks, etc. We rarely use those more than once, because we want each experience to be sort of viscerally unique to the listener. And especially in those opener and outro songs, I always try to pull in music that conveys a particular emotion. So some people have commented like, well, what the F do you have rap music or hip hop music at the end of that episode 1? Listen closely, if at all. If ever we've included songs with lyrics, listen to the lyrics. There's much intentionality that goes into those music selections. And that's all by design. And frankly, apart from writing, if people could see how much time I spend reading the narrative and listening to different music to establish the best fit for the type of track and the type of mood we want to elicit. So generally there's an emotional factor that drives the music choice. If I'm trying to convey a particular level of sadness, empathy, and severity of something that's about to happen, I'm not going to play rap music at that point. I may go with a single piano, single keys, very sad high notes. If we're about to talk about very gruesome details of a particular crime, I may go into really low droning, non-rhythmic droning patterns, high bass, to just really challenge your senses and to take you to a place that will force you to confront those details in a way that sort of forces you to put yourself there and be empathetic to what that might have been like. And I think we do that much better than a lot of podcasts, or at least more intentionally so. Not necessarily better, but with more intention and more purpose in the way that we select and include music. Somebody says here, I love the fact that the majority of Invisible Choir's cases aren't the same old stories blasted across podcast after podcast. Do you find it at all difficult researching stories that haven't been told elsewhere? Yes and no. The nationally prominent cases generally are the ones where multiple news agencies have already submitted the public data request. A lot of those archived files are available fair use, Creative Commons, public use. One of the reasons I decided to start this show too was, not only my personal experience, but after walking through one prison in particular, I'd looked at the daily inmate profile. And in this particular prison that I was walking through on this particular day, there were some 458 individuals who were convicted of homicide in this prison. And I would look at these daily inmate profiles just to get a sense of what type of environment I may have been walking into. If I was escorting media, conducting interviews, or any number of different things. And once I started to see and look at the sheer numbers of people who kill other human beings, um, we should never feel compelled to do those cases that other shows are covering in mass. There are so many other stories out there that need to be told. Families whose voices need to be heard, victims whose preventable deaths need to be told in a respectful and compassionate way. Those cases may be more difficult to research. They may require more public data requests, more interaction with local news sources, people directly or peripherally involved in the crimes themselves, etc. But every case is difficult. If any of you wanted to start a true crime podcast, and if you ever thought, and with a slightest inkling that it's something that's going to be easy, you probably shouldn't start a podcast. You'll be one of the dozens or hundreds that quickly fade out, because it is a tremendous amount of work if done correctly, if done compassionately and accurately. Every episode, and this is another question, how many hours of research or recording goes into a single full-length episode? For every hour of content fully produced and engineered that you hear on the show, typically we've had between 45 and 60 hours of labor or work gone into that episode. Even if I don't write an episode, if one of my writers, and right now it's only Stephanie, if Stephanie hands me a 27-page script, generally I'm still gonna invest 20 to 25 hours, if not a little bit more even, of work into narration, pronunciation, rewrites on the fly, fact checking, sound editing and design, production, sourcing of music. One thing I do that I've noticed not every podcast does, because I continue to hear these editing errors, when you get into producing content that's 30, 40, 60 minutes plus, you have to listen to the final product, and you should listen to it 2 or 3 times with a very critical ear to make sure your pronunciations are correct, to make sure you've not left out a critical detail, for any number of reasons. But so many times I hear really good shows that all of a sudden they've got an editing gaffe where they missed 15 seconds of audio, or you can hear them, their initial narrative recording, and then you hear them give it the second go around. They didn't listen before they clicked publish, and I find that baffling. And I'll listen. If it comes Sunday and I'm not done with the episode, I'm not going to force myself to get it done. I'll work like hell to get it done on time for our production schedule, but I'm never going to prematurely put something out when it may jeopardize the quality. And that's why we put 50, 60 hours plus in some cases into these cases. Another question that we have here: what can we expect from the future of Invisible Choir? We're growing very rapidly. I always joke, and sometimes I include in my premium introductory narrative that I'm getting tired, or I'll tell the premium subscribers, look, I'm sick as hell. We had a 24-hour hostage drill, so I was working a good 35 hours one time, spent the night in a prison running drills. And one of my premium mini episodes was, 25, 30 hours late, because I had to get some rest, frankly. But one of the things you can expect from Invisible Choir moving forward, the continued level of quality, attention to detail, dedication to that, bringing a particular level of compassion and empathy to these cases. We're not writing fictional stories. And I always when I hear people talk about storytelling, I always feel a little weird about that, because we're not telling stories. We are examining cases, is the best way that I can put it. These aren't necessarily our stories to tell, but there are cases to convey in a particular way that needs to be respectful, compassionate, empathetic. We don't need to, as other shows have done, I have my own particular views on interjecting comedy in this space. I don't think it's appropriate. Maybe a particular level of gallows humor or morbid curiosity. I get it. I see it all over social media, but that's why you're never going to see me posting memes from our account, exploiting, someone's real life murder, or murder in general. I don't find anything funny. I don't find anything remotely funny about it. You're not going to hear me cracking jokes. Maybe shop talk behind the scenes. Everybody has a little bit of gallows humor or whatever you want to call it, but you're never going to hear me put that out in produced format. That may open the doors to mass popularity a little bit and be what people are more comfortable with. But when we put these stories out on Invisible Choir, they're done with a very precise level of intentionality, down to the point where I'll even sometimes sort of map the story arc of emotion. One of the things I always try to do and encourage my writers to do is to take the listener through an emotional journey. Homicide itself at times involves great highs, great lows, tragedy, trauma. Generally there's more to the story than just the gratuitous detail of the tragic and horrendous death and how it occurred or what tools were used to facilitate someone's murder. Generally there's a human story, there's a human element behind the scenes. That's one thing that we really work to try to include and build into the story. So apart from that was actually the last question that I had. What other podcast, if any, there's a couple more here. What other podcasts, if any, do Invisible Choir writers enjoy outside of true crime? I can't speak for them, and I may solicit that information. I know that most of us listen to quite a bit of true crime, though given my limited time and capacity nowadays between work, Invisible Choir, and just research and writing, I rarely listen to true crime. Maybe it's the brain bleaching. Maybe that's what I use my time with for podcasts now. I listen to the Joe Rogan podcast all the time. I think he has fascinating guests on. I think he tends to provide a really well-balanced critical analysis of social discourse and things that are going on politically. He talks a lot about technology and other cool stuff like that. I don't listen to a lot of true crime anymore, in part because I need a disconnect. I can't be immersed in it 24 hours a day. Otherwise, I'll retire sooner from this as an endeavor. But apart from that, again, love comedy films. Films in general. I love movies. I go to the movies once or twice a week. I go for the emotional experience, and I hope that dedicated level of emotional investment. I don't hear a lot of podcasters talk about it, but that's something that's extremely important to me, because I want to take your emotions through the range or through a spectrum. I want you to at times be angry and upset. I want your blood to boil. I want your pulse to increase. At other times, there are certain episodes I've produced and executive produced other content into when I know it's going to make a lot of people tremendously sad, because that's part of the story. And if during a 60-minute period, if I can take you through a range of emotions, those are the stories that tend to stick with you longer. I've forgotten most every podcast or movie or book I've ever read, watched, or listened to that didn't engage my emotional faculties. And I think that just has something more to do, pure and simple, with story and how we as humans consume information. So, what to expect of the future of Invisible Choir. What do I enjoy most? I think a continued primary dedication to that intentionality behind emotion. I'm not trying to shock and awe people with gore, with gruesome details. I am, however, trying to very intentionally take every listener that will go along on the journey with me on a very tumultuous, emotional roller coaster. You're going to feel the highs and lows. And if anything, you should come to expect from the show moving forward. The writing, the production, the music, the audio sourcing, all of it will revolve around the idea that we want you to engage at a deeper level than you otherwise would. We're not telling you the news. We're examining someone's tragedy. We're examining someone's very real tragedy. For most, the very worst thing that's ever happened to them or someone in their family. And so we shouldn't read it like we're reading the news. We shouldn't read the affidavit of arrest or the criminal complaint while telling jokes and drinking wine. That's my own philosophy, and I'm sticking to it. You'll never hear comedy out of the show. You'll continue to hear a dedicated level of compassion, empathy, respect, and emotional investment in the writing and the production of the show. So that's all for now. I do obviously thank my team. Thank you to John, who used to do a lot of research for us. He's kind of moved on to other things as of late. He occasionally comes back and helps out. Thanks to Seth, who did quite a bit of heavy lifting early on in terms of the script writing and getting our show off the ground. And to Stephanie Moore, who is a brilliant legal writer and has just exhibited a phenomenal understanding of the court systems and how they, in certain instances can re-traumatize victims, can ignore victims altogether, and can create or contribute again to those systematic failings or those preventable crimes. So again, thank you to all of you. I'm about to get back to work. I need to drink some tea, get the voice ready for a couple hours of narration tonight. We've got a fascinating story coming out for you this Sunday. I hope to get it out at least 48 to 72 hours early for all of our paid subscribers. It's a story, it is the story that got me into true crime. I'm not going to reveal it just yet, but it's the case that got me writing about true crime. And it was the first case that I ever published when I originally launched Invisible Choir. It's one of the more horrendous cases involving missing and murdered Indigenous women, and it was one that hit close to home for me because I knew some people who knew some people that knew the victim, and I heard things developing as people were learning information, and so it's a seminal case in my true crime career, so to speak. And so I'm glad to be rewriting it, remastering everything, and bringing you a whole new examination of that case. If you want a clue, go out to invisiblechoir.com, take a look at the graphics. I always hide Easter eggs and everything that I put out. So take a close look. I want to thank each and every one of you again. This is some random weird experiment that turned out to be way more successful than I could have ever dreamed. And frankly, I think that we're going to continue to grow at a rate that still to this day makes me very uncomfortable. But that's kind of what we signed up for by dedicating so much time and effort to quality and compassion. So take care of each other. Thank you so much for your support. And for folks, I mean that from the bottom of my heart. The contributions you make directly impact the quality of the show. Even though it's only $5 a month, some of you are putting $15 a month out there. I'm working my ass off to put out great content, to send you swag in the mail, to keep the quality sky high. And I'm always going to be transparent with folks. There may be times when I need a little bit of rest because we're operating on the skeleton crew, but I'm always going to be doing it for you all. So if you do have other questions, don't hesitate to message me. Most people know that I'm extremely responsive on social media, extremely responsive on Patreon. Send me a message. Again, I thank each and every one of you for your continued support. The only reason I continue to do this is because of you. Otherwise, I would have called it quits long ago. But too many of you showed up, and so now I feel accountable. So thank you so much for your generosity. Take care of each other. I hope that you continue to listen to the show, continue to share it with friends and family. And if ever we misstep, I want you to be the first to let us know so that we can fix any issues, any problems, even if they're very minor pronunciations, even if, or if it's something huge that that wasn't on our radar. We count on feedback from you, and we love the support. Thank you. Have a great night, and have a safe rest of your week.